on the pilot community flood signage scheme. I'm Rosie Wilmot. I'm just an officer in the Sustainability and Climate Change team at Herefordshire Council. I'm just facilitating this session. We're getting quite a lot of interference there. If you could all just mute your mics, that would be really helpful. So we'll be hearing directly from Lauren Harrison, who's the Assistant Drainage Engineer with Balfour Beatty, about the scheme. And Lauren will take us through what the Community Signage Scheme is, how it functions, who it's for, and how to register your interest. The presentation element of the session will run for about 20 minutes, and we've got about 20 minutes at the end for Q&A. And if you have got any questions as we're going along, if you just pop them into the chat, we'll pull those out at the end, and we'll have a nice long time to address any of your queries with Lauren. But for now, I'm going to hand over to Steve Hodges, who's the lead officer at Herefordshire Council on flood risk management. Thanks, Steve. I'll hand over to you. Thank you.
Yeah, hi everyone, and thanks very much for attending today's session. Yeah, just wanted to tell everyone a bit more about the community flood signage scheme, and you know what's involved, and in essence, what the scheme is. It's an opportunity really for for volunteers to safely close roads and prevent vehicles from driving through floodwater, helping to prevent accidents, help improve flood resilience, mitigate damage to property, and really help to protect the most vulnerable members of the community. Lauren is on the call, and Lauren really has been dealing with a number of inquiries since the scheme went live back in the summer of last year. We've had a few schemes go live, and Lauren can tell you a bit more about that and the process that we have in place. Conscious that there's a number of people on the call, and you might have some specific queries relating to specific locations around the county. If we can keep any queries on the call to more general queries, we can pick up on any specifics. By all means, if you want to have a conversation with us following this call, leave your contact details and a bit of information in the chat, and we can follow up on that. But yeah, if I just hand over at this point to Lauren, and she can go through the scheme in a bit more detail.
Yeah, so further to what Steve said, the scheme is basically allowing approved and qualified volunteers to close the roads, and obviously Balfour Beatty are currently doing this in flood events, but this is to kind of supplement their work and allow, in some instances, the roads to be shut sooner than they would maybe otherwise be able to attend. So kind of allowing the closure to happen sooner to the event, and then hopefully mitigate damage and vehicle damage and incidents as much as possible. So we kind of outline where may or may not be eligible for the scheme, because this isn't the answer for every location. This scheme is purely for locations that are frequently and severely affected by flooding, where roads become impassable, cars could become stranded, and where properties are located quite fairly close to the highway and maybe then affected by bow waves should cars try and drive through the floodwater. It's only feasible where the highway is severely affected and on a regular basis. There needs to be a sufficient number of willing volunteers hoping to participate in the scheme for each location. This is purely for health and safety, and for manual handling of any signage and road closure equipment. So we cannot even consider a scheme when if there are not a sufficient number of volunteers. But I know that a lot of communities want to work together to get these schemes in place, so hoping that this isn't an issue for most locations. But where it isn't suitable, this isn't suitable for A roads. We cannot endorse members of the community without proper training to close roads that are A roads and with a high speed limit. And again, roads that maybe have only flooded once or twice in their history or to a shallow depth is not something that we would be able to grant as part of this scheme. And again, the very important point is a location where there is no turning points for vehicles. We cannot implement a closure where there's not a safe turning point either side of the closure, because otherwise we're just going to end up with cars backing up, and that isn't safe. So if you are interested, we encourage you to email the flood risk email on the screen, and I'm sure that will be circulated, because this is how we can review initially where may or may not be suitable, because like it said here, it is a case by case basis. Not all locations will be viable for this scheme, but we will be reviewing each individual case and to try and promote a scheme where possible. And as part of it, if you do have a scheme set up and you do become a volunteer, you'll be signed up as a Herefordshire Council volunteer, which covers you under their insurance schemes. And as part of that, you don't need to have any previous experience to be a flood signage volunteer. You just will have to attend a half-day training session upon having the scheme implemented, which will cover risk control, highway safety, manual handling where required, water safety, all things like that, and conflict management as well. It may be that as part of as being a volunteer, you have to work in sociable hours to deploy the signage, depending on when the flooding occurs, and you may be required to move signage, so you need to be able to manually handle signage, and depending on the distance of where these are stored, it may be considerable, so that should be something that is considered. And if you are interested in the scheme, we require a bit of detail to support your inquiry in terms of where you want the closure to be set up. So we would require a map with preferably what 3-word locations are helpful to show exactly where you think the flooding occurs and where you then think the associated road closure should go. And photographic evidence of the road in flood, if you have it, to demonstrate where the extent is, to ensure the closures are at an appropriate location. The speed limit on roads that you want to close should be identified as well, so that we can consider this as part of our review. And again, for the volunteers, we'd need names and phone numbers and email addresses, as that's what's required as part of the policy document, to ensure that we've got contact details for everybody wanting to be part of the scheme. And again, it has to be a sufficient number of volunteers to support the scheme. Depending on the signage that gets approved for each individual community, it may require storage. So that as well needs to be considered. It has to be stored as close to the proposed closure locations as possible, whether this is someone's garage who wants to be part of the scheme, or a town hall, or somewhere that's accessible to all volunteers. That's most favourable. And obviously personal safety equipment would be provided as part of the scheme. And so as well as that, all volunteers would have to intake the in-person training session. We cannot facilitate people joining the scheme that haven't undertaken the training session. So that's why it's important to onboard as many volunteers from the start as we can, to make sure that they're all included in the training session, which is organised to try and work with you as to when your best availability is. But this would likely require manual handling training at the same time, so we would allow a half day for that. We have got 3 schemes currently up and running within Herefordshire. Alton was the first, and they, as you can see there from the pictures, the road becomes completely impassable and it is completely dangerous for vehicles to be driving through it. So they were set up with road closed due to flooding signs and barriers to close the road at appropriate agreed points when the river gets to a certain level. And as far as I am aware, this has been going really well. And then we also have Greyfriars. That's a slightly different situation where it's largely a no through road, but it just having the signage out and formalised has prevented vehicles trying to attempt to drive through the water. So that has been successful again. And then Bodnam is our most recent signage scheme that we've implemented, and they've got a slightly different arrangement again, whereby they've got fixed drop-down signs. So the road liable to flooding part is constantly fixed in position, and at agreed points they are allowed to deploy the road closed element of the sign to facilitate the road closures as agreed, which is obviously that scheme is slightly different to the others, but as we've said previously, this is a case-by-case basis. All signage is bespoke to the area depending on the scenario, which is why we require the information from the start, and so we can implement a specific scheme for each location. That's as far as the presentation goes, but obviously very open to questions. We'd just like to reiterate that it may be that a signage scheme isn't the most appropriate thing for your location. In any event of highway flooding, we would encourage you to report it via the website and calling the number that's on this PowerPoint and on the website, because that informs our understanding of the road flooding issues in the county, and can then inform where the possible community signage schemes could be implemented.
Brilliant. Thank you, Lauren, and thank you, Steve, as well. We have had a couple of questions come into the chat already. I do see that you've got a hand raised, Mark, so we will come back to you as well. But just to address the questions that are in the chat, we have got a question. I know that you've answered that, Steve, but maybe just for the sake of the group, you could speak about what counts as a regular occurrence. And you've said about locations being impacted on a number of occasions. Is that in a single year?
I guess what we're just trying to draw the line between is, if there's been a one-off flood event versus there's a number of locations across the so I get a lot of feedback. That's better. Yeah, just trying to draw the line really between, I guess, areas that have been impacted, say, by a one-off flood event versus locations across the county that are really susceptible to flooding on a repeated basis. So I think that there isn't a number we have in mind, but I guess what we're conscious of is if roads are becoming impacted time and time again by flooding, then it's those kinds of locations I guess we'd be really interested to liaise with communities on, and just to see what we can do to help support that.
Brilliant, thank you. And we have another question about what would be considered a sufficient number of volunteers. Is that again a case-by-case basis?
Yeah, it really depends upon the location and I guess the size and extent of the closure. One of the examples there, one of the schemes exists, say, in Greyfriars Avenue, which is a residential street, in the centre of Hereford. So that's and there's no through road there, so that's a fairly limited closure that's required there. Whereas other locations, maybe more rural and maybe bigger in extent. For example, there may be different ends of the village that are impacted. So so you might need people at both ends of the closure. Again, I keep saying case by case basis. It really does depend. But I guess what we're just keen to do is just make sure that any schemes that do come forward are sustainable, and that localities aren't over reliant on one or two volunteers. That there are there is sufficient coverage. Things happen. So yeah.
And just further to that, in terms of like we've had some schemes where there are multiple signage road closure locations. So we've previously allocated a couple of volunteers to each location based on their proximity, if they live close by, and in terms of carrying the signage, if it's flood barriers and flood signs, I think there's a manual handling requirement for at least 2 people to be available to carry the signage into the correct position. So it's kind of like Steve said, it's very dependent on a lot of things. There's no clear cut number, but it's just obviously the more you have, the better. And in the event that someone isn't available or is ill or is away, obviously having a greater number is preferable.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Lauren. And thank you, Steve. Mark, we'll come to you now. I know you've had your hand raised for a while. Thank you.
That's okay. It's not a real hand. I'm fine. Hi, everyone. Thank you. This is a great initiative or great scheme. I've got 2 questions. One is there's a notorious flooding area near me. And the thing is that Balfour Beatty has undertaken some works there. They've done some dredging, some gully clearing, some alterations. So would we have to wait to see next winter whether that was effective? Or can we set up in anticipation, because it is a notoriously bad flooding area and the chances are it won't flood as often, but it is going to flood. So that's the first thing. Do we have to wait to see if there's been an improvement? And the second thing is who arranges the communications? Does each group have to set up its own WhatsApp or its own group communications, or is there some suggestions here from the scheme on how to communicate, between group members and to log it, keep a history, keep pictures, keep records, so that your group, your teams can benefit from a bit of recording on this?
Yeah, so in terms of your second point regarding a log, each policy document that's set up for each of these schemes has a log in the back end of it, which we ask you to keep a record of every time you've had to deploy the signage and the dates and photos, everything like that. In terms of communication, in Bodnam and Alton, I feel, and probably Greyfriars too, I imagine that it's a WhatsApp. I know for Bodnam it is a WhatsApp where all volunteers are enrolled in a group, and there's 2 coordinators for Bodnam to ensure that there's coordination in terms of deploying the signage. But obviously this isn't kind of monitored by us. We give you guys the responsibility to coordinate this as a group, as part of the scheme. So that's what we'd kind of expect in terms of coordinating it and communicating between the approved volunteers. Everyone would receive each other's contact details as part of the policy document that you'll all have sight of. And in terms of the first question, what it would have to be is I'd speak to the technicians which have done the works. They're on our side at Balfour Beatty. If they corroborate that it is a notoriously badly affected location, I feel like then a scheme could be positive in that location. It's purely just assessing how frequently and how likely the scheme would be deployed in terms of financing it and making it viable from that perspective as well. But likely that if they've done works there, they'll know the full history of the area and would be able to give me a bit more of a steer on that.
Yeah,
okay.
and I'll just add to that. Yeah, no, thanks, Lauren. And yeah, I guess, Mark, happy to have a conversation with you on the specifics of that. But yeah, I'd encourage that conversation. And like you say, if it's flooded numerous times before, then it feels like an appropriate location for us just to get on board, really. But yeah, happy to discuss.
Okay, thank you. Will do.
Thanks all. We've got a comment here from John Lee just about being the main risk properties being on an A road. I know this was covered, but if you could just reiterate the kind of consideration of A roads for the scheme.
Yeah. So I think really safety is paramount. So we don't want to be putting people into unsafe conditions or locations. I think in terms of, I know the location John's referring to, so there may be scope there, and I need to follow up on this in terms of some more advisory notices that could get advisory signage that perhaps could be used in that location to help minimize the impact. But John, let me come back to you specifically with that location, and we can discuss that a bit further and just look at what we can do there.
Great, thanks, Steve. Got an interesting question about whether permission would be required before they're able to put signage up, or if that's if you could talk about how they reach that decision as the volunteers. Thank you.
Yes. So every location is obviously flooded by a different mechanism at a different level, all sorts of different variables which influence the highway flooding. So as part of the initial conversation, we'd ask you to consider what we refer to as a trigger point. That would be an agreed, possibly a river level, rainfall level, flood depth level of the highway that we would go back, review and approve as part of the scheme. So you would only be permitted to deploy the signage upon that trigger point being reached. This wouldn't necessarily be, it wouldn't come from us. We wouldn't say, oh, the river has reached this level. It would just be outlined within the policy document that you would abide by that trigger level, and that level of trust would be there for that to be honoured and followed as part of the scheme. But as part of the deployment and of the signage to close the road and to then remove the signage and reopen the road, there is an email that you would all be made aware of when completing the policy document, that you would have to email at the earliest convenience of deploying the signage and then removing the signage to make us aware of the road closure and reopening, so that could then be published to the Herefordshire Council website as part of the road closures that occur during flood events, as would usually occur when Balfour Beatty go out and make these closures themselves. But no, it wouldn't be an instruction from us. It would be an agreed point where you'd be then permitted to deploy the scheme as agreed and in line with the signage and arrangement that we go through and approve.
Great, and just to clarify then, so that trigger point triggers the point at which that signage goes out, and then once it recedes below that trigger point is when the signage is also brought back in.
Yes.
Great stuff, thank you.
And that's different depending on each location. Every one of these schemes so far has had a bit of a different trigger point, and so we discuss that with you as the residents that know the flooding situation most in detail, and we work with you on that to make sure it's appropriate and makes the most sense.
Brilliant. We have a question about what happens when somebody ignores the closure. If cars do go around any of those signage and end up in trouble, what's the protocol?
Yeah, I can pick up on that one if you like. And I think if representatives were here from Allerton, they'd be able to recount an experience that they had. So yeah, they had an example whereby a driver ignored the signage, and caused bow waves, that caused issues. It breached residents' flood defences. They were what they did locally was they liaised with the police, who were, like I say, really helpful. The driver was identified. The driver was, reminded of the consequences of, driving through floodwater, and was able to warn that driver that ignoring measures, is a crime that could result in prosecution. So I guess, in answer to that, ignoring the signage, does have consequences, and we do routinely liaise with multi-agency partners on that. So yeah, that's a good question to raise. Thank you.
I believe there's also a initiative from the police that's called Operation Snap, whereby people can report vehicles that do not adhere to the rules of the road. I believe that's on our training document, that we encourage people to report it if that does then happen, which obviously would in hand go with the other work that Steve's outlined.
Great, thank you both. John, you've raised your hand. Did you want to come in and ask your question? John, you're on mute. I don't know if you're trying to speak. If you want to unmute yourself and ask a question. Not hearing anything, John. So we'll move on to another question that's been asked in the chat. But feel free to come in if you're having technical difficulties. We can come back to you. Oh, it's not a question. It's just thanks. So yeah, really helpful to clarify that it'll be about the trigger points for the in and out of the signage. So thank you. If any other questions, I don't think I've missed any in the chat. So feel free to raise a hand. Dave, go for it. Thank you. Oh no, duck back down again. Is it possible to deploy slow signs? Oh, carry on.
Sorry,
Dave.
I was messing about with the mute button. My apologies. I'm representing Aston Ingham, and we have a set of rain gauges and flood sensors that when they reach a certain point, a flood alert goes out to members of the community to let them know that if it gets to that level, it's more likely it's flooding the road. We can't put in the scheme that you're providing because we can't find anywhere to turn vehicles round other than about 2 to 3 miles away, which is just too far. Would it be possible for us to put Herefordshire onto our flood alert system so that when it reaches the high level, a WhatsApp message would be sent to you so that you can observe when we flood?
Yeah, Dave, happy to have a conversation with you on the logistics of that and the best mechanism for making us aware. But yeah,
okay, all right,
I'll follow up with you. Yeah,
thank you.
Thank you both. So just back to the question of whether it's possible to deploy slow signs. Is there any signage or any scope in the scheme for that?
Go on, Steve.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I was going to say, because in some locations have been brought to our attention, that there may be benefit in getting some advisory signage out. When roads may not be impassable, but there may still be consequences from people driving through. So yes, I guess the short answer is yes, there is potential, but I guess you just need to be careful just in terms of conscious that in some locations there's a lot of signage, so we just need to be I guess we just really need to understand the consequences, and I guess it's really important that we have suitable numbers of volunteers who are able to to deploy those signs and bring them back in when it's no longer relevant. But if there are specific examples or locations people want to flag to us, then by all means get in touch and we can look at specific locations.
Brilliant, thank you. Can you just talk about the policy you were speaking of, Lauren, and whether that's individual to each road location or parish?
Yeah, so each community would have their own document, and within that it would detail all proposed road locations that are to be closed as part of the scheme. So if there's multiple locations, each of those will be detailed within the document. And say if there's multiple road closures within the same community area, then they may be individual trigger points for each of those locations. They may not all flood at once. They may flood separately for separate reasons, but that would all be covered under one document. All volunteers would be covered under the one document, and then the log would all be produced under the same document. So yeah, only one document, but everything's covered as part of that.
Amazing, thank you. That's great. We haven't got any other questions in the chat at the moment. So if anyone's got anything to ask the speakers, then please either raise your hands or pop your question in the chat, and we can address that. But just to reiterate what was said at the start as well, just to confirm that everything will be circulated. So if you need to come back to the recording or to the slides just to cover off anything, then that will be possible, because we'll share this all after the presentation's over. Likely early next week, but you'll have that in your inboxes very soon. Great. So we've got a question from Dan, just saying they've got 3 flood points and they're waiting for training. Is there any scheduling indication for that, Lauren? Thanks.
I'm in talks with our drainage technicians about the suitability of the points that you've sent to me, Dan, for Llangaren. So I'm going to follow that up with them at some point in the next week or two and get back to you on any further information we require and kind of the next steps for you for Llangaren. But I have received your email with the proposed closure points. So hopefully we'll get back to you within the next week or two on that.
Thank you. We have a question about whether it's just parish councils and flood groups, but not individuals, or can groups of individuals apply as volunteers?
I can take this one if you like. In terms of the 3 schemes that are already in place, they have come through primarily from flood groups. Conscious that there may not be flood groups in all locations across the county, so I know we've had expressions of interest, I think, from parish councils as well. I think the key consideration really is in terms of understanding the number of volunteers from a community who are able to to get involved, and then I guess just understanding how those volunteers then link in with, like say, with the parish council, with any flood groups that are there. So I think the key thing really is in terms of numbers of volunteers, just making sure that it is sustainable from a local perspective. But again, if you're interested, get in touch, and we can we can clarify, we can have a conversation, and and we can talk you through what we've done in other locations, if that would be helpful.
Great, thanks, Steve. Hopefully that was helpful. Any other questions, folks? We have got a few more minutes. If nothing else comes in, that's absolutely fine. I think we've covered a lot. It's been really great to have your questions, and really great to hear about the scheme, which is obviously doing a lot in places already. So in the lack of any questions coming in and any hands being raised, I think we'll leave it there, and just thank you all again for your attendance, and thank you, Steve, and thank you, Lauren, for the presentation, the information, and again, the links that are in the slides will come along with the slides, so you can follow up on any additional questions or reach that point where you can register your interest through there as well. Fantastic. I'm going to stop recording now, folks, and we'll leave the session there. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.